6:30 a.m., Polk County, Florida. Manuel Castillo checks the underside of a leaf and finds something almost invisible moving through a cluster of nymphs. Not the pest. Something hunting it. What is turning the tide against one of the worst insect invasions in American agricultural history costs almost nothing. Most consumers have never heard of it. In the summer of 1998, agricultural inspectors in Palm Beach County, Florida, noticed something unusual on residential citrus trees. Tiny insects, barely visible to the naked eye, clustered on new leaf growth in numbers nobody had documented before in the continental United States. They collected samples. Under magnification, they found a psyllid nobody recognized in American groves. Small, narrow-bodied, mottled brown with wings that angled upward in a distinctive tent shape when at rest. It was Diaphorina citri, the Asian citrus psyllid, native to the Indian subcontinent and southern China, almost certainly arriving on imported nursery plants years before anyone noticed. By 2000, it had spread through South Florida. By 2005, it had reached the central growing regions around Polk and Highlands counties. By 2008, it had crossed into Texas. By 2008 as well, it had been confirmed in California. As of this year, the Asian citrus psyllid is established in nearly every citrus-producing state in the country. The mechanics of how it destroys an industry are simple and exact. The psyllid itself does only modest direct damage feeding on leaf tissue. The real threat travels inside it. As the insect feeds on an infected tree and then moves to a healthy one, it transmits a bacterium called Candidatus liberibacter asiaticus, the pathogen behind citrus greening disease, known across the industry simply as HLB Huanglongbing. The bacterium colonizes the tree's phloem, the same tissue that moves sugars from the leaves down to the root system. A heavily infected tree cannot feed itself anymore. It starves slowly, the canopy thinning from the top down, the fruit dropping green and lopsided before it ever ripens, usually within 5 to 8 years of infection. There is no cure. None. Once a tree tests positive, the only options are managing its decline or removing it before it becomes a reservoir, infecting everything around it. The damage was not theoretical. Florida alone once produced over 240 million boxes of oranges a year at its industry peak in the late 1990s. By the time HLB had spread through nearly every commercial grove in the state, that number had collapsed by more than 70%. The United States Department of Agriculture estimated cumulative economic losses to Florida's citrus industry alone at more than $4.5 billion by the mid-2010s, with tens of thousands of jobs lost as packing houses, juice plants, and entire supporting industries shrank or shut down. Nationally, when you add eradication programs, insecticide costs, nursery inspection regimes, quarantine enforcement, and biological control research across Florida, Texas, California, and Arizona, researchers and industry groups have placed total spending on fighting the Asian citrus psyllid and HLB at well over $600 million over the past 2 decades. Federal and state governments responded with everything they had. Quarantine zones restricting the movement of citrus nursery stock and budwood across state lines. Mandatory psyllid trapping and inspection protocols at every licensed nursery. Aggressive insecticide spray schedules, sometimes a dozen applications a year per grove during peak outbreak periods, costing growers hundreds of dollars per acre annually. Tree removal and replacement programs paid growers to bulldoze symptomatic blocks before the bacterium could spread further into neighboring groves. The United States Department of Agriculture, through its Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, poured tens of millions of dollars a year into psyllid suppression programs at the height of the crisis, including area-wide spray coordination across entire counties. It did not stop the spread. Before we explore the surprising science behind the recovery now underway in groves across 3 states, we have to face the first challenge growers and researchers ran into: understanding an enemy that moves on the wind and reproduces faster than any spray schedule can outrun. One of the early miscalculations in psyllid control was treating it like an ordinary grove pest, something a strong enough chemical rotation could simply eliminate. In reality, a female psyllid can lay up to 800 eggs across her lifetime, and under the warm, humid conditions typical of Florida and the Rio Grande Valley, a new generation can complete its life cycle in as little as 2 to 3 weeks. Miss a spray window by even a few days, and a suppressed population did not just recover. It rebounded past where it started, often carrying chemical resistance the previous generation had not had. Worse, broad-spectrum insecticides killed off the handful of native predators already present in the grove, clearing the field for psyllids to recolonize even faster on the next flush cycle. The solution researchers eventually turned to was not a stronger chemical. It was a wasp. Tamarixia radiata, a parasitoid barely a millimeter long, smaller than the psyllid nymph it hunts, native to the same regions of the Indian subcontinent and southern China the psyllid itself came from. Unlike a broad-spectrum insecticide that kills indiscriminately across a grove, Tamarixia does exactly one thing, and does it with surgical precision. The female wasp locates psyllid nymphs, the immature, nearly motionless stage that clings to the underside of new citrus leaf flush, by detecting chemical and vibrational cues the nymphs give off while feeding. She positions herself beneath a nymph, drives her ovipositor into its body, and lays a single egg inside. Her larva hatches and consumes the nymph from within, eventually emerging as an adult wasp ready to repeat the process on the next generation of nymphs colonizing the same flush. USDA scientists had actually identified Tamarixia radiata as a candidate biological control agent as early as the 1990s. Working out of overseas research stations studying psyllid populations in their native range, anticipating that the pest might eventually reach American shores, given how easily infested nursery stock moved through global trade. When the psyllid was confirmed in Florida in 1998, that earlier groundwork meant researchers were not starting from nothing. Quarantine-reared colonies of the wasp were already established in containment facilities, and by the early 2000s, the USDA and the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences began field releases in citrus-growing counties, first in small experimental plots monitored leaf by leaf, then more broadly as parasitism data justified expansion. Still, releasing a parasitoid wasp across millions of acres of working farmland is nothing like opening a jar and walking away. To succeed, the timing and method of release mattered just as much as the insect itself. Researchers learned to release adult wasps directly onto active flush growth, the soft new leaves where psyllid nymphs concentrate, and to do it during the cooler hours of morning or late afternoon when wasps were less likely to disperse before settling. Early release efforts that ignored flush timing or that coincided too closely with a grower's existing spray rotation saw poor establishment. The wasps simply could not find enough living nymphs to parasitize before the population crashed from chemical exposure or before the wasps themselves died off from heat and dehydration. And so the science of biological control became its own discipline inside the broader citrus industry, mapping flush cycles county by county across the growing season, coordinating release calendars with individual grower spray schedules, and tracking parasitism rates across thousands of monitored sentinel sites from the Treasure Coast to the Rio Grande Valley. But all those numbers and field protocols only truly matter when applied to one grower's actual rows. And the story of one Texas operation shows that more clearly than any USDA report ever could. On the outskirts of Mission, Texas, in the heart of the Rio Grande Valley, 58-year-old citrus grower Daniel Reyes once watched his family's 200-acre grapefruit operation slide toward collapse. Psyllid pressure had been building for years, and despite spraying nearly every 3 weeks during peak flush season, HLB symptoms began appearing in block after block, the telltale blotchy yellow leaves spreading faster than he could remove infected trees. The cost of insecticide alone was running him close to $400 an acre annually, and he was still losing roughly 15% of his trees to disease progression every single year, a pace that would have wiped out the operation within a decade. Instead of doubling down on chemicals, Reyes enrolled his grove in a regional Tamarixia release program coordinated through Texas A&M Agri-Life Extension. Over 18 months, researchers released thousands of lab-reared wasps directly onto flush growth across his property, timed carefully around a deliberately reduced spray schedule. The wasps needed minimal pesticide interference to establish a foothold, so Reyes cut his insecticide applications nearly in half, reserving them only for the most severe localized outbreaks instead of spraying on a fixed calendar regardless of actual psyllid pressure. It was an uncomfortable adjustment, he later admitted, watching psyllid trap counts climb in the short term while trusting that a wasp population he could barely see was quietly building beneath the leaf canopy. The result was remarkable. Within 2 seasons, parasitism rates on psyllid nymphs in his groves climbed above 60% in monitored blocks, and his psyllid trap counts dropped by more than half compared to neighboring untreated groves running a traditional full-spray program. Through consistent scouting, careful flush-timed releases, and a willingness to trust a slower biological process over an immediate chemical one, Reyes brought his annual tree loss rate down from 15% to under 6% within 3 years. He did not eliminate HLB. Nobody has anywhere in the world. But he bought his trees time, and time turned out to be the one thing the wasp could give him that no chemical rotation ever could. And that was just the beginning. For once the wasp established itself across a grove, its real impact unfolded over years, not single seasons. From the test plots at Florida research stations in the early 2000s to commercial groves spanning 3 states today, the spread of Tamarixia radiata tells its own quiet story of recovery. However, establishing a biological control agent across millions of acres is not simple, because success depends on conditions far beyond any single release event. Tamarixia is sensitive to cold, struggling in regions with hard winter freezes, which limited its effectiveness in parts of inland California's Central Valley compared to the more consistently warm, humid groves of South Florida and the Rio Grande Valley. It is also highly vulnerable to the very insecticides growers had relied on for years to manage psyllids directly, meaning any grower who wanted the wasp to thrive had to fundamentally rethink decades of spray habits built around a chemical-first mindset. Researchers found that the most successful outcomes came not from choosing wasps over chemicals or chemicals over wasps, but from integrating both deliberately. Selective, narrow-spectrum insecticides applied only when psyllid populations spiked above an established economic threshold, paired with sustained Tamarixia populations handling the background pressure year-round across every block, including the ones too small or too remote to scout intensively. This approach, known across the industry as integrated pest management, allowed the wasp to do what it does best, relentlessly hunting nymphs across millions of leaves that no human scouting crew could ever physically cover in a season, while growers reserved chemical intervention for genuine outbreaks rather than routine maintenance spraying. University of Florida entomologists tracking long-term release sites found that in groves where Tamarixia established successfully, psyllid populations dropped by 60 to 80% compared to untreated control groves, sustained year after year with no additional human intervention required once the population stabilized. The wasp asked for nothing. It required no fuel, no labor crews, no spray equipment, no renewal contracts, no annual budget line item. It simply kept reproducing on the same food source the psyllid kept providing, generation after generation, completely free of charge to the grower or the state. Beyond Florida and Texas, the program expanded into California as the psyllid pushed westward into the state's citrus belt around 2008. California's citrus industry, valued at over $3 billion annually and centered on fresh market oranges, lemons, and mandarins rather than processed juice, faced an even higher stakes fight since fresh fruit buyers had far less tolerance for any visible disease symptoms on the rind. The California Department of Food and Agriculture partnered with the University of California, Riverside to mass rear and release Tamarixia across both commercial groves and dense urban citrus zones, recognizing that backyard citrus trees scattered across suburban Los Angeles and San Diego were just as capable of harboring psyllid populations as a 500-acre commercial block, and just as capable of hosting the Wasp's quiet recovery work. Volunteers and homeowners were enlisted to host small release kits in their own yards, turning ordinary residential neighborhoods into an unlikely front line in a fight most of them never knew was happening over their own back fences. The story of the Asian citrus psyllid is a powerful example of how an industry facing an existential threat eventually found its answer not in louder chemistry, but in quieter biology that had been waiting in a research freezer since before the crisis even began. Once seen as an unstoppable epidemic capable of ending commercial citrus farming in multiple states within a generation, the crisis instead became the proving ground for one of the most thoroughly documented biological control success stories in modern American agriculture. From the research stations identifying the wasp years before the pest ever crossed the Pacific, to coordinated multi-state release programs spanning Florida, Texas, and California, to growers like Daniel Reyes rebuilding an entire spray calendar around an insect smaller than a grain of rice, this is the slow, leaf-by-leaf recovery of millions of acres of American citrus. Once an industry standing on the edge of collapse, citrus-growing regions across Florida, Texas, and California have found, through Tamarixia radiata, a partner that costs nothing once established and asks for nothing in return. It's a story of how biological control didn't replace human effort so much as redirect it, away from blanket chemical warfare applied on a fixed calendar and toward precision, patience, and trust in a natural process that science had identified decades before anyone needed it. But here's the bigger question. Can biological control ever fully outpace a disease with no cure? Or will citrus greening remain a permanent cost of doing business in American agriculture for as long as the crop is grown here? In this slow-moving war between bacterium and beneficial insect, will growers ultimately gain the upper hand? Or will citrus farming simply learn to live permanently in the shadow of HLB the way it has for the past 2 decades? The answer may shape the future of citrus on every coast where it's grown, and the answer to whether the next invasive pest gets met the same way, with patience and biology, or with another $600 million spent learning the same lesson twice. Across the country, growers are finding solutions every day, and we're here to share them with you. Hit subscribe and explore more stories.